Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about an epic story of an epic king, appropriately called the Epic of Sundiata, the Lion King of Mali. The story actually has many different names, but we're going to go with the name Lion King of Mali, just because it really captures the essence of this particular story. So you may have heard of the Epic of Sundiata. And before we go ahead and dive further into it, I want to start with sort of a disclaimer, if you will. I don't speak Mandé, which is the language that this tale was originally told in. And while I've made a great effort to try to find the proper pronunciation for the names in this story, I want to make clear that it is entirely possible that I'm going to butcher a name or mispronounce a name, and I want to sincerely apologize for that in advance. I'm not a linguist. I'm just a high school history teacher doing my best here. So that disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the Epic of Sundiata. So what is the Epic of Sundiata? The Epic of Sundiata is an oral epic of a king and the founding of an empire, such as the legend of Gilgamesh or the Epic of King Arthur. And in this case, it's the founding story of the Malian Empire, which ruled over parts of West Africa from about 1230 until the early 1400s. And this story is very popular even to this day. It is taught in schools in West Africa, and it's become part of the national folklore and epic of several nations, including the contemporary nation of Mali, Gambia, Senegal, and Guinea. So where does this story take place? Well, the story takes place in the twilight years of the Ghana Empire of West Africa, which ruled over large swaths of the territory just below the Sahara Desert from around 500 to 1200 CE. Now, this empire ruled over many vassal peoples who pledged fealty to the Ghanaian emperors, such as the Soso, the Mandika, and the Mema, who are all going to be main players in this particular story. At this time, the story takes place, the Ghanaian Empire is actually fragmenting, and the various groups underneath the empire are breaking away and sort of asserting their own independence. Now, the Ghanaian Empire had been wealthy on the trade of gold across the Sahara. This is known as the Trans-Saharan trade routes. But this gold had created sort of an eye for the territory and the gold mines of Ghana. And this had led to military incursions from northern Africa, specifically Morocco, which had dealt a great deal of damage to the ability of the Ghanaian Empire to hold itself together. It's also possible that at this time, the expansion of the Sahara Desert might have been having an impact on the Ghanaian Empire. This was during the period of the medieval warming, what's called the medieval climate anomaly, where the temperatures were unusually high. This will be followed, of course, by the Little Ice Age later on. But the point is, in addition to military difficulties, the Ghanaian Empire may have also been suffering from ecological difficulties. But regardless, the empire was beginning to crumble. So let's take a look at some of the characters that we're going to encounter as I give you a quick recap of this particular story. Now, the full length of the Epic of Sundiata is very long, perhaps 40 different chapters. And it's usually recounted in spoken word or song. It's not usually written down, but you can find text versions of it if you have a real interest in reading it yourself. So the main character, the hero of the story, is Sundiata Keita, and he has a companion, a griot named Bala, who is his friend from a very young age. His mother is named Sogolon, and his father is the king or the ruler of the Mandika people called Naré Maghann. He has a stepmother, sort of who plays a negative role in the story, called Sasuma, and there is also an evil sorcerer or antagonist named Soumaoro, who is going to be sort of the challenge to Sundiata. I show this picture here. This is a very often reproduced picture of Sundiata as an epic king on a horse riding into battle. As we'll see, this becomes sort of the part of the legend. But let's go over the story in brief. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details of the entire story because it's a very long story, but I am going to give you a rough outline of the story in as brief a span as I can. And roughly the story breaks into about 5 large parts. This is my own sort of breakdown of the story. You could probably find other ones out there. So the story starts with a prophecy and the birth of Sundiata, which then leads to the exile of Sundiata. And in his exile, Sundiata grows in strength and his ability to lead. Sundiata is called to return to challenge the wicked king Soumaoro. And then there's a great battle in which Sundiata defeats Soumaoro. So let us start with the prophecy. So the ruler of the Mandika people, the first leader of Mali, if you will, Naré Maghann, was told by a hunter that if he were to marry a very ugly woman and have a child, that child would grow up to be a great king. The king didn't think a lot of this. He thought it was kind of silly. But then not too much time later, some hunters came and presented him with a very, very ugly woman named Sogalon, which actually means buffalo woman. That was the name because she was supposedly as ugly as a buffalo. And the king remembered the prophecy, and so he married her and eventually had a child by her, and that is Sundiata, our hero of the story. Unfortunately, it didn't look good for Sundiata out of the gate because he was crippled from the waist down and unable to walk. And it was said that he literally had to drag himself around the palace. And despite this, his father loved him and gave him the griot Bala to be his companion. And so from a young age, he lived in the palace, but it didn't seem like he was going to fulfill this great prophecy. And maybe the prophecy had actually been a mistake. Sadly, a short time later, Naré died, and his first wife, Sasuma, who was supremely jealous of the fact that her husband had married this woman on the whim of a prophecy, had her own son put on the throne, despite the fact that Naré had explicitly said he wanted Sundiata to be on the throne, keeping the prophecy in mind. And Sasuma definitely did not like Sundiata and made his life very difficult, including sending his griot Bala away to make peace with the rising power of Soumaoro, the wicked king of the Soso people. And this is sort of like a side story, if you will, but Bala is actually taken prisoner by Soumaoro and held. And this will be possibly one of the reasons that Sundiata goes back to confront the wicked king Soumaoro. Depending on what version of the story we're looking at, either Sundiata and his mother Sogalon are exiled by Sasuma, or they flee for fear of their own safety. It depends on what version of the story you happen to be reading. But either way, Sundiata leaves the kingdom, and he goes and lives with the Mema people to the west. And during this time, Sundiata begins to grow in strength and learns the ways of the other people of the Ghanaian Empire, kind of growing in physical strength as well as growing in leadership. In this case, he does learn to finally walk while in exile. The story of how he learned to walk, again, depending on which version you're listening to, he might have learned to walk in one of two different ways. The story goes that his mother, who was grieving again for the loss of her husband, the king, asked her son, Sundiata, to fetch her some leaves from the baobab tree, which is a very common tree across almost all of Africa. And supposedly, Sundiata, realizing that he needed to do this for his mother, said, "I will learn to walk today." And one of two things happened. Either one, he used an iron rod created by some smiths to physically move himself up and learn to walk, or he might have used a branch from the baobab tree and then learn to walk. Again, depending on the version of the story you're listening to, but either way, he did learn to walk upright that day. And according to legend, he literally ripped out the tree from the ground and carried it back to his mother instead of just bringing her some leaves like she asked. And after this, he becomes a fierce hunter. He begins to hunt animals. He begins to train. And this is when he starts to become known as the lion, because he is such a fierce hunter. And so maybe that prophecy is actually going to come true. While he is exiled, the sorcerer king Soumaoro, who is king of the Soso people, which were one of the peoples of the Ghanaian Empire, he begins to expand his territory. Now Soumaoro is portrayed as a very wicked king. It's said that he wore the skins of man, had shoes made of human skin, kept the skulls of kings in his private residence to absorb their power. It was said that he was able to intimidate other rulers into doing his bidding because he could kill them with a whisper. He's portrayed quite evilly in this story. and he begins to capture all the former vassals of the Ghanaian Empire. And this includes Mali, where he drives away Sundiata's stepmother and half-brother. And at that point, the nobility and the soothsayers and the griots of Mali and the Mandika people send for Sundiata. They say, we need him back. He must come fulfill the prophecy and rescue us. And Sundiata decides he's going to come back, but he needs to reach out for guidance. And he reaches out and contacts the spirits of his ancestors, as well as the spirits of nature, to give him guidance and give him strength for this confrontation with Soumaoro. And so, in this case, Sundiata had impressed the Mema king, who he'd been living with for many years, so much that the Mema king actually gave him half of his army. And Sundiata also marched and gained the support of other peoples around the Soso kingdom, or the growing Soso kingdom, who didn't like the wicked king Soumaoro. And this included Soumaoro's nephew, Fakoli, who Soumaoro had kidnapped his wife. And so with the help of Fakoli, as well as the Mema army and various groups that opposed the wicked king Soumaoro, Sundiata confronted the king at what is known as the Battle of Quirina in 1235, and it was sort of touch and go over the course of 2 days, but eventually Sundiata found the weakness of the king Soumaoro, which was that he could only be harmed with an arrow made from the foot of a rooster. And so he, according to legend, he shot him with an arrow made from the foot of a rooster, and was able to drive him away. It doesn't say that he killed him. Some versions say it killed him. Other versions say that he just disappeared. But either way, Sundiata is victorious. He returns to Mali. He lays down the foundation for an empire, and he becomes the first king of the Malian Empire. And that is the short version of the Epic of Sundiata. So you might be wondering, well, it's such an epic story. How was it all remembered? Well, in West Africa, there's a very long tradition of oral storytelling, and the people whose job it is to keep these stories and tell these stories are called griots, and they are a class of historians, storytellers, praise singers, poets, and musicians in West Africa. Now, a griot could be a very high-class griot who served the king, like Bala served Sundiata, or you could just be the village griot that keeps track of the comings and goings and the histories and the births and the deaths of the village. And when I say that this was their job, I don't mean this was like a side job. I mean, literally, griots, their entire job was storytelling. It is storytelling. It is keeping alive the memory of the people, keeping alive the culture. And this was a full-time job passed on from parent to child. In a way, they were, in fact, a social caste in society. Now, what's interesting about the story of the Epic of Sundiata is that it incorporates pretty much a lot of major traditional African elements, and sort of seeks to explain the origins of some traditional West African practices, such as the balafon, which is this instrument you see right here, which is played by many griots today. The wicked king Soumaoro, sorry, I'm mispronouncing things, Soumaoro, was in fact said to have invented this, and it gave him power when he played it. Soumaoro was also said to have sort of been the embodiment of African magic, if you will. He had many abilities that are traditionally associated with African gods, like he could keep the power of animals by keeping their skin. He could keep the wisdom of kings he had defeated by keeping their skulls in his sort of secret residence. So there's an element of magic there. But Sundiata is also known to have sort of an element of magic with him. So, for example, he sacrificed a number of animals to the spirits before his battle with Soumaoro in order to gain strength and wisdom and guidance before that battle. There's also some of the physical elements in the story as well, such as the use of iron. Iron has, if you know your African history, you know that ironsmithing has a very long history in Africa. And the wicked king Soumaoro, it is said that his family, according to the legend, to the epic, his was the family that discovered fire and ironsmithing. And there is a long tradition in West Africa, particularly of associating the creation of metal and iron almost as a kind of magic. And you know, when you think about it, it is sort of magic, right? If you heat something up, you can combine elements together to make something stronger. It is sort of like magic in its own way. Also, the fact that iron in some versions allows Sundiata to walk kind of again testifies to this sense of like iron as source of magic or the example of magic, right? But there's also the baobab tree, which is very common in West Africa. It's usually the site where people are buried when they died. A lot of graveyards have baobab trees in them, and it's sort of a symbol of the spiritual importance of a place. And so again, some versions of the story have Sundiata learning to walk only when he takes the stick of a baobab tree, and only then can he walk, again sort of testifying to the spiritual importance of this tree to the peoples of West Africa. And then there's also just the animal elements, for the fact that Sundiata's mother is described as the buffalo woman, because she supposedly is ugly as a buffalo. Sundiata himself, his name actually means son of the lion. So the first part of his name means son, and the second part, Jata, means lion. And so also, if any of those elements of the story sounded vaguely familiar, the death of the king, the exile, the challenging of a wicked leader, the exile by a family member, if it sounds familiar, that's because these are very common elements in fairy tales, as well as in particular Disney's Lion King. Literally even the title, The Lion King. Disney has never officially said that they borrowed any of this story, but some of the comparisons seem a little too similar for coincidence. There's also the fact that Soumaoro keeps a serpent with him, and this is sort of an example of negative magical powers, right? A snake is usually not viewed as a good thing, and it was the same in West Africa. This was kind of evidence that he was not a good guy, if you will, because he kept a serpent with him at all times that supposedly gave him sort of supernatural powers. There's also the fact that Islam was present in the Ghanaian Empire and was present in West Africa. And by the time of the Epic of Sundiata in the 13th century, Islam had been around for a while. And it's actually mentioned a few times in the epic. So Fakoli, the nephew of the wicked king Soumaoro, who rebelled against him because his wife had been kidnapped by the wicked king, is in some versions of the story a Muslim. And part of the reason that the wicked king Soumaoro seeks to defeat him is because Soumaoro feels threatened by the power of Islam as the new religion in West Africa that might potentially upturn his own authority. As for the hero of the story, Sundiata, most clues in almost every version, most versions agree that he was probably not a Muslim. But this is interesting because most people will quickly recognize that Mali became a very well-known Muslim empire later in its history, right? And so sometimes later griots who were Muslims would claim that Sundiata was actually descended from Bilal, who was one of the first Muslims, one of the first, what are called the mezzanines, who do the call to prayer in Islam, who was, they will say that Sundiata's mother was actually descendant from Bilal, and therefore Sundiata is descended from Bilal and has a connection to the early Islamic community. There's some versions where he's even in some way connected to the Prophet Muhammad himself. But there are other examples of sort of the syncretic blend of Islam with this epic. So in some versions of the epic, the ancestral spirits that Sundiata prays to before he goes to battle are recast as the jinn, or angels in the Islamic sense of the word. And so it's interesting the role that Islam plays in this, as sometimes being completely absent, sometimes being an element to the story, in light of the fact that Islam would later go on to play a very large role in the Malian Empire. And this is the founding story of the Malian Empire. There's also the interesting fact of horses as they were utilized in the Great Battle of Karina. So both sides of the battle, both Sundiata and the wicked sorcerer king Soumaoro, used horses in the battle. But Sundiata made better use of them. And in the end, they were sort of pivotal to his victory over the wicked king. He managed to, the wicked king tried to outflank him, but he managed to turn the horses away using bows and arrows. And then he used his own cavalry to defeat the wicked king. And this is interesting because the Malian Empire, the Empire of Mali, would go on to use horses as the center of their military force, much more than their predecessors in Ghana ever had. And this would sort of become the backbone of their military strength. This is in part because Arabian stallions, which are considered some of the best horses around, were becoming widely available as the trans-Saharan trade picked up. More horses were coming from North Africa, and more horse breeders were coming down into Ghana and the Sahel and being able to breed these beautiful Arabian stallions. And so they would become a greater and greater part of the Malian Empire's military force. And so that's sort of foreshadowed in the story, which I think is really interesting. And so when we look at the broader case of world history, the Epic of Sundiata is really interesting. It's first and foremost a tale of morality. It's a tale of like right and wrong, because I mean, even knowing like nothing about like significance and morality in West African culture, the fact that the dude who kidnaps people, who wears human skin and keeps human skulls, is the bad guy and is defeated, is a fairly straightforward morality tale of, you know, what's right and what's wrong. But this epic is more than just a morality tale. It justified the rulers of Mali, right? Sundiata's descendants, which included amongst them the famous Mansa Musa, who took the Great Hajj to Mecca and famously bankrupted the Egyptian economy by giving away so much gold. They could look back on this story. This was the epic that defined who they were and kind of defined the people of the Malian Empire, right? But what's interesting is that when you read and look at the Epic of Sundiata, or you shouldn't say read, when you hear the Epic of Sundiata, through the morality and through the right and wrong, you can kind of see the social political situation in the Sahel and how it's changing, right? The increasing amount of trade on the trans-Saharan trade networks means larger kingdoms. It also means challenges from outside of the kingdoms, right? You have the challenge of Islamic kingdoms from Morocco potentially coming down and disrupting the order of things. You see horses shifting the balance of military power, and you see the increasing influence of Islamic scholars, some of them in some versions of the story even being rulers that are threatening the power of traditional African rulers, right? As they are I got a really embarrassing typo there. They are a new source of knowledge for African rulers. Right. And so there's all these changes going on in the Sahel that you can kind of see through if you look at the epic very carefully. But you don't have to necessarily. The epic itself is a very entertaining tale with a lot of really cool plot twists and turns. And if you're someone who really likes to read into mythology and great stories, then I would completely recommend checking out the Epic of Sundiata. You can find it published in most major bookstores. Will probably have a copy of it somewhere. One other thing about the oral tradition, the beautiful thing about oral tradition is that, in fact, a lot of people might think oral traditions, like what the griots do in maintaining the history, might think that that's a negative thing and it's not reliable and that people forget. But again, I think that's a more beautiful thing, right? Because when you think about it, that does give a certain level of flexibility where the story can change ever so slightly to fit the audience and can change ever so slightly to fit the current situation. And when you study the evolution of these stories, then you can kind of get a really good picture of how society itself was changing over time. So I'm going to leave some resources on these slides. If you'd like to check out some more information about the griots or a breakdown of the great battle between Soumaoro and Sundiata, or if you'd like to hear a short live version of the Epic of Sundiata, you can check this out, as well as an easy overview of the Epic of Sundiata can be found here. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Mr. Little, and I hope to see you next time.